Apprentices, you're up. What's up, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in. This week we've got apprentices, and we've got some good ones and some not so good ones. So let's check out the first one sent in. This one is submitted by Anna, who has been tattooing for about 7 months. And Anna, you sent over this, I'm assuming this is a Pokemon? Regardless, this thing is super colorful, I'll give it that, but it could definitely use some work, especially when it comes to line weights. You know I love them. You know I say this all the time, especially when it comes to illustrative style or cartoon style looking tattoos, you just want to tattooify them. This thing has one singular line weight running throughout the entire thing, which isn't bad, but it can definitely be enhanced by multiple line weights. Typically, I'll put a thicker line weight around the entire border and save those smaller line weights for all the details inside. Having some extra black in this tattoo will just make those colors pop a lot more, and it will give the tattoo some overall weight. You can use a thinner line weight on those little circles in the top of this thing and even in the drool, and just really fatten up that entire outline perimeter with a nice beefy outline.
Where's the beef?
You do have a few shaky lines around this tattoo, especially when it comes to that bottom right leg, so you really got to tighten those up, and I would suggest even giving it a practice swing like you would in golf. Go over the motions above the skin before actually laying down the needle. It'll just help build that muscle memory, even if it's just for a couple seconds. I do see you added some black in those red areas, which I would have shaded out a little bit more because it is a bit choppy, but I also would have added it to some of the blue, especially at the bottom of the body. It would just make this thing a lot more three-dimensional, maybe even adding some shadows underneath those red berries and those yellow pieces of hair, leaves. I don't know. But overall, this is a solid design for an apprentice to hone their skills. You did send over another one as well, and I'm gonna say the same thing about this one as I did with the previous one. You gotta beefing up those outlines a bit, especially around the outside perimeter. This design in particular has a lot more room for those smaller lines, so you definitely wanna add a chunkier outline around the outside just to give it some dynamics. You can tell when you look at the bottom wings of the moth how much impact those big black outlines have. So I would just suggest running a thicker outline around the entire thing, and it would look a lot more clean. You definitely have some squiggles all over the place in this one though. And it's not really in one spot, they're kind of all over. You've also got some blowouts, especially when it comes to the top left of this tattoo in that furry little antenna. So that just goes to show me that you don't really have full control of your depth, because that shouldn't be happening. The shading in the leaves is also all over the place. You really gotta tidy those up. And if you're gonna put stipple shading in the moth, then I would probably suggest using a mag to shade those leaves, just to give it some nice contrast. And if you did use a mag, they wouldn't look that scratchy. Even on the tuft in the middle of the moth's back, you have these lines that are running right in the middle of it, and none of them are working well with each other. They're kind of just like wah, 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 wah. You gotta control that. You gotta get them going in the same direction. Trust me, it'll look a lot nicer. I might suggest doing just the outline on a tattoo like this first and then work on the shading, because I'm not sure if you were rushing or what, but it definitely feels that way. Or just slow down and be patient. There's no reason to get through this thing as fast as possible. Now I know this design is a lot more intricate than the possible Pokemon, but when we compare the two, you can definitely tell you had a lot more confidence when it comes to the execution with the Pokemon. Just try to stick with designs that you know you can knock out of the park. And if you are going to do designs that are a bit more intricate, just try to slow down and tackle it piece by piece. Just try to keep in the back of your mind line weights and how much they can affect your overall piece. But thank you so much, Anna, for sending those over and letting us take a peek. All right, the next one sent in is from Mitch, who's been tattooing for 6 months. And Mitch, the first tattoo you sent over is this Juice WRLD portrait. Now I will say, tattooing for only 6 months, this thing's pretty damn good. You've got all the facial shades in the right place, and that mustache looks super realistic. The eyes are facing the same direction, which is always a plus. We get a lot of portraits that end up looking like this. I will say, as far as the face goes, my least favorite part is the dreads. They do have a lot of good-looking texture, but I think you went a little too far when it comes to those small dots that are just scattered throughout. You have to understand the texture of hair and what it actually looks like. Instead of having these small dots, I would really chunk those up a bit and use thicker outlines or thicker mags to make them feel like hair. Coming from a bald guy, I know hair. Trust and believe, I fantasize about it a lot. But I do really think that those little adjustments would make these things a lot more tight. The shadow coming down on the face I think could be a little softer. The shadow is a bit harsh. The hair being that far away from the face and casting that kind of shadow, I do think that shadow should be a bit softer. But it's not bad, it is believable. Now as far as my least favorite part about this tattoo has nothing to do with the face, it's that rushed brick in the background. I don't know if you plan on adding to this in the future or what, but as it sits, those bricks just look completely out of place and unfinished. I probably would have added those at a different date or just left them out altogether, because this tattoo as a whole would look a lot better without those hashy looking weird bricks in the background. You did a pretty good job when it comes to the letters. I like how it's nice and solid black up at the top, and it has this graffiti-esque fade when it comes to the bottom. And you can't really tell where those dots start and end, so I think you did a good job with that gradient. My bet would be you started at the bottom like most of us do and you did those bricks last. But I'm just critiquing as I see it. Tattooing for only 6 months, I'd be ecstatic if my apprentice pulled this off. I might hit him with a brick for doing those bricks, but that's beside the point. You did send in another one, so let's check that out. This is I'm gonna call this some kind of samurai, some kind of orc, ogre, samurai, maybe Shao Kahn from Mortal Kombat. I don't really know. Either way, this thing's banging. The first thing I will say is I do really like that thorny looking negative space shape that you have running throughout this entire thing. It just gives it a nice overall composition. I do really like how far back it looks like the face is sitting when it's underneath that skull cap because of all that shadow that you have in there. It just gives it some nice depth. I do think you have a lot more freedom when it comes to adding those little textures in the face, like those little dots and striations, because this is a fictional character and it's not supposed to be a smooth face. So it works. I will say at the bottom of this tattoo, most likely where you started, the shading that is there looks a lot more smooth than the shading at the top where it's a lot more hatchy. My guess would be you started to rush when you got near the end. A badass tattooer by the name of Nico Hurtado once told me that if you're starting to rush through a tattoo, just stop. Come back to it later. There's no reason to get this thing done all in one go. You can always add another session later. But the eyes are menacing, and I really love how it draws our eyes into them. But everything that you have going on in this tattoo, when it comes to contrast in light and shadow and in texture and even a good composition, I think you'll pretty well knock this thing out of the park, especially for tattooing for only 6 months. So Mitch, great job, and I appreciate you so much for sending those over. All right, up next we've got Rock out of Slovenia, who's been tattooing for just 1 month. Rock, you sent over this skull and flower tattoo, and I gotta say, this is exactly what you should be going for with how long you've been tattooing. I will say maybe it's a little advanced for 1 month, but you nailed it. Like I said before, when it comes to line weights, you have this nice thicker outline around the border of this tattoo, and you saved all those small thin line weights for the inside. It just makes for a much more dynamic tattoo overall. I do think you went a little overboard when it comes to the outline on that top flower. I would like to see the shapes of those petals a bit more. And that's just making sure you follow the outline of the petals no matter how big the outline is. I gotta say, I do really love the thinner line weights that you have on the inside of the skull. It just adds a nice texture where I think most people would probably just mag shade it. One part that does get a little confusing to me is where the skull meets that lower left flower and how there's just a gap of skin tone there. There's no really shading underneath it. I don't know if that's where the skull ends and the flower begins or what. I think it's supposed to be petal on petal. It's just a little confusing. I probably would have used a thinner line in that area just so it's more easily readable. I think an easy way that we can fix that is by adding a little bit of shading on the underside of that petal, kind of like a drop shadow, just to separate them a little bit and make it easier on the eyes. One thing I'm not a huge fan of are these tiny little circles that you have coming from that flower. I can't really see those circles staying together forever. It's probably gonna end up as one big black blur. Not very nice. You want to simplify that, again, tattooify it, even if the original design looks that complicated. You want to give that thing some room to breathe, much like you did in the skull. The outline around the teeth does feel a bit harsh. I think you could have thinned that up a bit more. I just would have liked to seen a little more detail in that area instead of that thick outline. For once. But overall, this is a great design to be able to pull off well, especially for a 1-month apprentice. Thank you so much, Rock, for sharing. Real quick, I want to take a break and give a shout out to the sponsor of this channel, Mad Rabbit. Mad Rabbit is a tattoo aftercare company that I've been using for quite some time, and I think you ought to give it a try as well. They've got all types of products to help you out with your tattoo, whether that's during or after, they've got you covered. So head on over to madrabbit.com, fill up your cart, and make sure to use code PONY20 to save 20% off of your entire order. All right, let's get back to it. All right, up next we have Jayden out of Niles, Michigan, tattooing for about 6 months. Jayden, you'd like to know what you can do better, and the first thing I gotta say is maybe work on your drawing skills. Skulls are one of the things that artists tattoo most of, and this isn't a great sign. I don't know who the skull belongs to. Maybe it's the sloth from Goonies. I just think this design could have been made better from the very start. The skull just looks very flat-faced. The nose doesn't look accurate. I mean, I've tattooed dozens of hundreds of skulls, and they don't really look like this. This thing is rough. Let's start at the bottom, shall we? The shadow on the jaw is just very muddy. The teeth aren't very clear. They kind of get lost on that lower part of the jaw. The outlines around the teeth are very messy. You can just tell that you're hitting these things over and over and over again. The shadows that are coming up from the teeth going toward the nose just look very amateur. The shadow around the nose, same thing. It just looks like you just put it in there just to put it in there. The cheekbone shadows don't really make any sense. It looks like the hole from the side of the teeth goes up and over the cheekbone. And on the other side, I don't really see any cheekbone. I'd love to see this reference because the eyes aren't really making a lot of sense either. You've got this massive gap on the eye on the right, and it's not really matching the eye on the left. Obviously, sometimes eyes can be organic and they're not gonna match perfectly, but these just seem like they're coming from two different skulls. Like maybe the skull had two different eyes. Also, the black in that left eye doesn't really look well saturated at all. I know I'm being rough, Jayden, but if you don't have anybody around to tell you what you're doing wrong, then you're just gonna keep going on with these bad habits. When it comes to the crosses, none of them are symmetrical, and that's maybe something that could have saved this tattoo. I'm just kidding, that wouldn't have saved this tattoo. Ryan says some of them look like they're melting. And he's not wrong. But when I look at the symmetry of the crosses, that just goes to show me that you're really rushing through this thing and just gonna get in there to finish the tattoo. When it comes to the clock, I think it's time you go back to the drawing board. The crack doesn't look realistic at all. The hands in the clock should be a lot longer. The numbers aren't clean. I mean, at the very least, you can make some clean numbers, because even if it's just the numbers, that should be the number one thing you're working on as an apprentice. Just solid, clean, simple, basic lines. The white outline going around the clock and those crosses aren't really doing anything for this tattoo. They're not gonna save this thing. I know I'm being harsh, but I don't really see any good quality in this entire tattoo. It's not the machine, it's not the tools, it's your drawing ability and lack of fundamentals. If you're gonna take this serious, go back to the drawing board and learn to lay down a solid design. And I'm not talking about skin, I'm talking about putting pencil to paper. Take a few classes at YouTube University. They're free and there's thousands of videos. You gotta teach yourself how to draw before you fuck somebody up big time. Good luck, Jayden, and send me some work in a year because I would love to keep up with your progress. But thank you so much for sending that over. Up next, we've got one sent in from Kat, who was tattooing for about 6 months at the time this was made. And Kat sent over a cat. How appropriate. I do love this tattoo. It's just very unfortunate that this thing is backwards. Normally I'm not a stickler about which way things are facing on what part of the body, but when something's facing the back of a person, clearly it's backwards. It would have been so easy to flip the stencil and make this thing face forward the way it should have been. With inner forearms, you can get away with it a little bit more, but when it comes to the upper outer arm, there's no reason for this thing not to face the other way. Now that I've got that out of my system, this thing is a pretty solid tattoo. I do really like how this thing healed. You've got some nice contrast throughout the entire tattoo, and you left open some skin areas, giving it some room to breathe. I can really tell that you've got control when it comes to your application because the line work looks great, the stipple shading looks great, and this thing is the perfect design to work on 6 months into your apprenticeship. I mean, maybe its beard is a little complicated, but you pulled off a nice hand-sized tattoo and you did it well. You really didn't go crazy with the white, which I really appreciate. You gave it a couple little dots here and there, just making those whites much more impactful. I mean, if I had to nitpick, I think that eye on the left is a little wonky, but I'm only saying that because the other two eyes are almost perfect circles. And honestly, that's probably just from the perspective. But overall, I think you did a great job on this thing. There's just not much for me to say. Just make sure you put these things on the right way. Thank you so much, Kat, for sending that over. All right, each week, you know we gotta give a shout out to the artist who I think did the best job. And this week, we gotta give it to Mitch with this Samurai Viking. At 6 months in, I'm kind of blown away with what you can accomplish. This thing is huge, and it's badass. You nailed it when it comes to contrast in light and shadow and in texture, and you've got some really great composition. That's 3 of the biggest things that I think a lot of people struggle with. And you nailed it. You can definitely tell that you've got some sort of art background and that translates super well into your tattooing. That's something I think a lot of these artists could learn from. So Mitch, keep up the great work, and I think you've got a successful career ahead of you. Thank you so much for sending that in, and congratulations once again. All right, now one of my favorite parts about the series is putting a spotlight on somebody who I think you should all be following. Now I will preface this by saying that when it comes to apprentice videos, I generally like to showcase somebody whose work could be easily implemented into your own workflow. But this week I couldn't resist. I found this artist whose work is absolutely unbelievable, and I couldn't go by without sharing it. Her name is Isa. She goes by Isa's Tattoos, and she works out of Germany. Her stuff caught my eye on the Explore page, and I had to go do a deep dive, and here we are. She has some of the cleanest black and gray and color realism that I've seen in a long time. Most artists can tackle either just black and gray or just color, but she kills it on all fronts. Her stuff is just so eye-catching. This is the one that initially grabbed my attention, but if you scroll through her page, all of her work is just as impressive. And some things that I find most impressive about her work is the way she uses light colors, which I find a lot of times to be very difficult. I just can't say enough good things about her, and she's only got 12,000 followers, so let's go blow her up. Head on over to her page, give her a follow, and let her know I sent you. Alright, that's going to be it. I want to give a huge thanks to all the artists who submitted their work, and a massive thank you to you guys for watching. Don't forget to subscribe while you're here, and as always, I will see you guys next week.